What I'm about to share with you has been hidden from the public eye for over 7 decades. The establishment doesn't want you to hear these words because they challenge everything we've been told about our existence, consciousness, and what happens when we leave this physical realm. In the autumn of 1951, just 3 years before his untimely death, Alan Turing, the brilliant mathematician who broke the Nazi Enigma code and laid the foundation for modern computing, gave an interview to a small philosophical journal. This interview was never published. The manuscript was confiscated, the recordings destroyed, and the journalist sworn to secrecy under the Official Secrets Act. But truth cannot remain buried forever. Through channels I cannot disclose, fragments of this lost interview have reached my hands. What they reveal is nothing short of revolutionary. Alan Turing, using the same brilliant logical mind that helped defeat Hitler and birth the computer age, had developed a mathematical proof for the existence of the human soul. Mathematics is the language in which God has written the universe, Turing reportedly said during this forbidden conversation. And through mathematics, I have glimpsed something beyond our physical reality, something that persists beyond the decay of our biological machinery. The establishment immediately recognized the danger. Here was one of the 20th century's greatest scientific minds challenging the materialist paradigm that underpins modern science. If consciousness isn't merely a product of brain activity, if there exists some fundamental aspect of our being that transcends physical existence, then the implications would shake the foundations of power structures that rely on a purely mechanistic view of human life. Turing's approach was revolutionary. Unlike religious arguments based on faith or ancient texts, he approached the question of the soul through pure logic and mathematics. Drawing on his pioneering work in computing, information theory, and his famous Turing test for artificial intelligence, he constructed a series of logical proofs that led to an inescapable conclusion. Consciousness cannot be reduced to mere computation or neural activity. If consciousness were merely computation, Turing argued, then a sufficiently complex machine could replicate it entirely. But there exists a fundamental logical barrier, a paradox that emerges when a system attempts to fully model itself. This barrier points to something transcendent in human awareness, something that exists beyond the material substrate. His work on this topic began in secret during the darkest days of World War II. While working at Bletchley Park breaking German codes, Turing experienced what he later described as moments of transcendent clarity, instances where mathematical insights seemed to come from beyond his conscious mind. These experiences led him to question the purely materialist explanation of consciousness. In his private journals, portions of which were declassified only recently under the Freedom of Information Act, Turing wrote, "The patterns I perceive in mathematics appear to exist independently of human discovery. They are not invented, but found. This suggests a realm of truth beyond the material, a realm where mind, or something like it, is fundamental rather than emergent." The authorities were alarmed by Turing's spiritual turn. Here was the father of computer science, whose work was crucial to the emerging Cold War intelligence apparatus, veering into territory that threatened the philosophical underpinnings of the scientific establishment. If Turing could prove logically that human consciousness transcended physical reality, what would that mean for the power structures built upon materialist assumptions? The manuscript of this interview disappeared into the classified archives of British intelligence. The few who knew about it were discouraged from discussing it, and Turing himself was subjected to increased surveillance. Some scholars have even suggested that his prosecution for homosexuality in 1952, which led to his chemical castration and likely contributed to his suicide, was accelerated to discredit him before he could publicize his more controversial philosophical conclusions. But now, decades later, as quantum physics increasingly suggests that consciousness may indeed play a fundamental role in reality, Turing's suppressed insights seem more relevant than ever. What did this brilliant mind discover about our immortal nature? And why were those in power so desperate to keep it hidden? Welcome back, seekers of truth. In this chapter, we delve deeper into the forbidden knowledge that Alan Turing uncovered, the mathematical framework that led him to conclude that the soul exists as a fundamental aspect of reality. According to the recovered fragments of his suppressed interview, Turing approached the question of consciousness with the same rigorous logic he applied to breaking codes and developing computational theory. His starting point was what he called the incompleteness of computational systems, an extension of Gödel's famous incompleteness theorems. Every sufficiently complex formal system contains truths that cannot be proven within that system, Turing explained. Similarly, every computational system, including the human brain if viewed merely as a biological computer, must be incomplete, unable to fully capture or explain its own operations. This led Turing to a profound insight. If human consciousness were merely the product of computational processes in the brain, we would be fundamentally unable to comprehend our own consciousness. Yet we do possess this self-awareness, this ability to reflect upon our own existence. This paradox, Turing argued, points to something beyond the physical. The fact that we can contemplate the nature of our own consciousness suggests that consciousness itself transcends physical computation, he stated. It exists in a domain beyond the material, what the ancients called the soul. Turing then developed what he termed his transcendence proof, a series of logical statements demonstrating that consciousness must exist in a realm that transcends the purely physical. The full mathematical notation has been lost, but the core argument survives. First, he established that any computational system is bound by the limitations identified by Gödel and by Turing himself in his work on computational theory. These limitations mean that no system can fully model itself. Second, he observed that human consciousness appears to violate this principle. We can contemplate our own existence in ways that seem to transcend computational limitations. Third, he concluded that this transcendent quality of consciousness points to an aspect of our existence that extends beyond the physical substrate of the brain, something that exists in what he called a higher dimensional information space. Information, Turing said, is neither physical nor immaterial in the traditional sense. It exists as patterns, as relationships, not as things. Consciousness, I believe, is a special form of information pattern that can exist independently of its physical medium, just as the meaning of a book exists independently of the paper and ink used to convey it. This insight was revolutionary and dangerous. It suggested that when the physical brain dies, the information pattern that constitutes our essential self, our soul, might continue to exist in this higher dimensional space. The implications threatened the very foundation of materialist science. In his private journals, Turing wrote about experiencing what he called mathematical visions, moments when complex mathematical truths would appear to him fully formed, as if received rather than created. These experiences led him to question whether mathematics itself existed in a Platonic realm beyond physical reality, a realm that the human consciousness could somehow access. There are moments, he wrote, when I feel as though I'm not discovering mathematics, but remembering it, as if these truths exist eternally, and my consciousness is somehow touching that eternal realm. What terrified the scientific establishment was that Turing wasn't speaking as a mystic or religious figure. He was using the language of mathematics, logic, and early information theory to point towards something that traditional science had long dismissed, the existence of a soul that transcends physical death. The authorities realized the explosive potential of these ideas. If one of the 20th century's greatest scientific minds was arguing that consciousness transcends the physical and could provide logical grounds for this belief, it would undermine the mechanistic worldview that had dominated Western science since the Enlightenment. Even more threatening was Turing's suggestion that future developments in computing might eventually provide empirical evidence for his theories. He predicted that as computers became more sophisticated, we would encounter limitations that would point toward the non-computational nature of human consciousness. The ultimate Turing test, he stated, will not be whether a machine can imitate a human, but whether we discover aspects of human consciousness that no machine, no matter how advanced, can replicate. Those aspects will be our window into the transcendent nature of the soul. Shortly after giving this interview, Turing found himself under increased scrutiny. His security clearance was reviewed, his research closely monitored. The scientific journals that had previously welcomed his work became suddenly hesitant to publish his more philosophical papers. Then came his arrest for homosexuality in 1952, a convenient way to discredit a mind whose ideas had become dangerous to the established order. The chemical castration he endured as an alternative to prison destroyed his health and spirit. 2 years later, he was found dead from cyanide poisoning, officially ruled a suicide, though questions have lingered for decades. The mathematical framework he developed for understanding the soul was buried in classified archives, deemed too dangerous for public consumption. But now, as quantum physics explores the role of the observer in collapsing wave functions, and as consciousness studies challenge reductionist views of the mind, Turing's suppressed insights seem more prescient than ever. As we continue our journey into the forbidden knowledge of Alan Turing, we must now explore perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of his suppressed work, the connection he drew between quantum physics and human consciousness, which he believed provided the strongest evidence for the existence of the soul. In the most controversial portion of the banned interview, Turing ventured beyond pure mathematics into the strange realm of quantum mechanics, a field that was still in its infancy during his lifetime, yet one that he had studied intensely in private. The Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics suggests that the act of observation affects the behavior of subatomic particles, Turing explained. This implies that consciousness itself may be fundamental to the fabric of reality, not an emergent property of matter, but rather something that interacts with matter in ways we are only beginning to understand. Turing was particularly fascinated by the famous double-slit experiment, which demonstrates that particles behave differently when observed versus unobserved. In his private notes, he wrote, "If consciousness affects quantum states, then consciousness cannot be merely a product of those states. It must exist, at least partially, outside the material system it influences." This insight led Turing to develop what he called his quantum soul hypothesis, the idea that human consciousness operates partially through quantum mechanisms that cannot be explained by classical physics or traditional neuroscience. The brain, he proposed, may function as a quantum receiver, a biological structure that interfaces with a non-local field of consciousness that exists beyond space-time. This would explain both the apparent localizing of consciousness in the brain and the transcendent experiences reported throughout human history. Turing suggested that the brain's neural microtubules, structures that were barely understood in his time but have since become the focus of quantum consciousness theories, might serve as quantum processing units that connect our physical bodies to this non-local consciousness field. If this hypothesis is correct, Turing said, then what we call the soul is simply the aspect of our consciousness that exists in this quantum field, a field that is not bound by the limitations of physical reality, including death. The implications were profound. It meant that when the physical brain dies, the quantum aspect of consciousness, the soul, would continue to exist in this non-local field. Physical death would not be the end of conscious existence, merely a transition to a different state. What made Turing's approach so threatening to the establishment was that he wasn't making mystical claims based on faith or ancient texts. He was proposing testable hypotheses based on emerging understanding of quantum physics and information theory. He was building a bridge between science and spirituality using the language of mathematics. "The division between science and spirituality is artificial," he stated in the interview. "Both are attempts to understand the nature of reality. The materialist paradigm that dominates modern science is not the result of evidence, but of philosophical assumptions that were made during the Enlightenment, assumptions that quantum physics is now calling into question." In his journal, Turing wrote about experiencing what he called quantum intuitions, moments when solutions to complex problems would appear in his mind fully formed, as if received from beyond rather than calculated. These experiences convinced him that consciousness operated beyond the limitations of classical computing. "There are aspects of human thought that happen instantaneously, too quickly for neural computation to explain," he noted. "These moments of insight feel less like computation and more like reception, as if accessing information from a field that exists outside of time." The authorities recognized the dangerous territory Turing was entering. If consciousness was fundamental rather than emergent, if it existed partially in a realm beyond the physical, then the materialist worldview that underpinned both Western science and the political power structures built upon that science would be threatened. Moreover, Turing was predicting that future scientific discoveries would increasingly validate his hypothesis. He foresaw a time when quantum computing would provide models for understanding how consciousness might operate beyond the limitations of classical physics. "The machines we are creating now are still based on classical computation," he said, "but the next generation of computers will harness quantum effects. As they do, they will help us better understand the quantum nature of our own consciousness and provide evidence for the existence of the soul." What terrified the establishment most was Turing's prediction that within a century, science itself would be forced to acknowledge the reality of the soul, not as a religious concept, but as a scientific fact supported by mathematical logic and experimental evidence. "The universe," he concluded, "appears to be not merely mathematical at its foundation, but informational, even conscious. We are not isolated beings in a dead mechanical cosmos, but expressions of a fundamentally conscious reality. What religions have called the soul is real. It is the aspect of our being that participates in this cosmic consciousness." Shortly after sharing these ideas, Turing found his work increasingly restricted. His access to cutting-edge research was limited. His proposals for new research directions were denied funding, and ultimately, as we know, he faced persecution that led to his tragic end. The interview was classified, the manuscript locked away, the recording destroyed, but the ideas themselves could not be completely erased. They have emerged in different forms over the decades since, in the work of quantum physicists like David Bohm, in the consciousness theories of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, and in the growing scientific interest in non-local consciousness. In this final chapter, we reach the culmination of Alan Turing's forbidden spiritual journey, his most profound insights into what he called the eternal algorithm, and how it relates to the fundamental nature of consciousness, reality, and the soul. The most closely guarded section of Turing's banned interview concerned what he described as his greatest discovery, that underlying all of existence is what he termed the cosmic code, a mathematical structure that connects consciousness, information, and physical reality in a unified framework. What we perceive as separate realms, the physical world, the world of mathematics, and the realm of consciousness, are actually different expressions of a single, unified informational reality, Turing explained. The universe is not fundamentally made of matter, but of information patterns that exist eternally, outside of time. This realization came to Turing during what he described as a profound mystical experience that occurred while he was working at Bletchley Park. Late one night, after days of intense concentration on breaking particularly difficult German codes, he experienced what he could only describe as a dissolution of the boundaries of the self and a direct perception of reality as pure mathematical pattern. "For a timeless moment," he wrote in his journal, "I ceased to be Alan Turing and became pure awareness, perceiving the mathematical foundations of reality directly. I understood that the patterns I had been studying weren't just useful abstractions. They were glimpses into the actual structure of existence itself." From this experience emerged Turing's most controversial theory, that consciousness itself is a fundamental aspect of reality, not an emergent property of complex systems, but rather the interior experience of information processing at all levels of existence. Consciousness, he proposed, is what information feels like from the inside. Just as matter is what energy looks like from the outside, consciousness is what information processing feels like from within. The human soul is a localized expression of this universal consciousness, a pattern within the cosmic code that persists beyond physical death. Turing developed a mathematical framework he called transcomputational dynamics to describe how consciousness interfaces with physical reality through quantum processes. This framework suggested that what religions have traditionally called the soul is actually an information pattern that exists partially outside space-time, a pattern that uses the brain as an interface with the physical world, but is not generated by or contained within the brain. When we die, Turing said, this pattern does not disappear. It simply loses its connection to this particular physical interface. The information pattern that constitutes our essential self continues to exist in the higher dimensional space that transcends our physical reality. What made this theory so dangerous to the establishment was that Turing was not merely philosophizing. He was developing mathematical models that he believed would eventually be testable as technology advanced. He predicted that as our understanding of quantum computing progressed, We would develop tools that could detect and potentially even communicate with these non-local consciousness fields. The computers of the future, he stated, will not merely process information as separate entities. They will participate in the unified field of consciousness that underlies all reality. As this technology develops, the artificial boundary we have created between science and spirituality will dissolve, and we will be forced to acknowledge the reality of what has traditionally been called the soul. In perhaps the most shocking segment of the interview, Turing suggested that his work on artificial intelligence was not merely aimed at creating thinking machines, but at developing a new way to understand the relationship between consciousness, information, and physical reality. The ultimate Turing test, he explained, is not whether a machine can imitate a human mind, but whether we can recognize that both human and machine intelligence are expressions of something more fundamental, the universal consciousness that religions have called God and that I call the cosmic code. This was too much for the authorities to tolerate. A scientist of Turing's stature proposing a mathematical framework that united consciousness, information theory, quantum physics, and spirituality threatened the very foundations of the materialist worldview that dominated Western institutions of power. The interview was immediately classified. The manuscript was confiscated. The few who knew about it were sworn to secrecy. And Turing himself found his work increasingly restricted, his movements monitored, and ultimately, as we know, his life destroyed through persecution and forced chemical treatment. But as Turing himself predicted, the truth cannot remain hidden forever. As quantum physics continues to reveal the observer effect and non-locality, as information theory evolves to encompass quantum information, and as consciousness studies increasingly challenge purely materialist explanations of mind, Turing's suppressed insights are being rediscovered, though few know their original source. In the end, Turing said in the closing moments of the banned interview, "What we call reality is neither purely physical nor purely mental. It is informational. And what we call the soul is our participation in the eternal information pattern that transcends physical existence. Death is not the end of consciousness, but a transition, a change in how our essential pattern interfaces with the larger reality." He left us with a final thought that still resonates today. The greatest scientific discovery of the coming century will not be a new particle or force or dimension, but the recognition that consciousness itself is fundamental to reality, that the soul is real, and that our existence continues beyond physical death. This is not a matter of faith, but of mathematical necessity, a truth written into the very structure of existence itself. As Turing predicted, science is slowly moving toward these conclusions, though few recognize that one of history's greatest scientific minds arrived there first, only to have his spiritual discoveries suppressed and hidden from the world. The banned interview remains officially classified, but its echoes continue to reverberate through the corridors of quantum physics, consciousness studies, and information theory. The truth, as Turing knew, cannot remain buried forever. The soul exists, not as a religious concept, but as a mathematical certainty, a pattern in the cosmic code that constitutes our essential nature and transcends physical death. This was Alan Turing's greatest discovery, and the secret knowledge that powerful interests have tried to keep from humanity for over 7 decades. But now you know, and knowing changes everything. If this forbidden knowledge has awakened something within you, if you felt the resonance of truth in Turing's suppressed discoveries, then our paths have crossed for a reason. The powers that be never wanted this information to reach you. For decades, they've kept these truths buried in classified archives, afraid of what might happen when people realize that science itself has proven what the soul seekers have always known, that we are eternal beings having a temporary human experience. This is just the beginning. There are more suppressed discoveries, more hidden truths that challenge everything we've been told about our reality and our place in it. Subscribe now to join our community of awakened minds. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next revelation that they don't want you to hear. Leave a comment below sharing your own experiences of consciousness beyond the physical. Those moments when you've glimpsed the eternal algorithm that Turing discovered. Your story matters. Your consciousness matters. The truth cannot remain hidden forever. Together we are bringing it into the light. subscribe, comment, share. The awakening has begun.